Hello, so we're looking at the positive or negative nature of trig functions. All right, so we have here our Cartesian plane and we can label the axes. We've got our x-axis along here and our y-axis here. Now we can also name the four quadrants. So this is our first quadrant, this is our second quadrant, this is our third quadrant, and this is our fourth quadrant. Now, when we link back to our unit circle here, we would remember that the cosine of theta is our x-coordinate, where the terminal ray intersects with the circle. All right, so that means we can just get the cosine of theta from that x-coordinate. We've got the sine of theta is equal to our y-coordinate, and we know that tan of theta is equal to the cosine of theta, the sine of theta divided by the cosine of theta. Okay, so what does this mean? That means if we look at cosine of theta, that means whenever you see an angle drawn out into this first quadrant, let me put a circle in and show you a bit more what I mean. So if I've got an angle coming out here, all right, that point there, the y value of that point gives me the sine of theta, and the x value gives me the cosine of theta. So in the first quadrant, the cosine of theta, which is the x-coordinate, is always going to be positive. All right? If we move over to the second quadrant, over here, the x-coordinate, which gives me cosine of theta, is always going to be negative. So that means that means cosine of theta will also be negative. Down here, the x value again is negative, which means I'm going to get a negative cosine of theta down in the third quadrant. And in the fourth quadrant here, the x-coordinate is positive, which means I'll get a positive value for the cosine of theta. So let me write that out. So the cosine of theta in this first quadrant is going to be the x value, which is a positive. In the second quadrant, the cosine of theta is going to be a negative value because x is negative there. Down in the third quadrant, again, the cosine of theta will be negative because x is negative in that quadrant. And in the fourth quadrant, the cosine of theta will be positive. All right, sine of theta, this is our y-coordinate. So in the first quadrant, the sine of theta is positive because y is positive. In the second quadrant, the sine of theta is also positive. In the third quadrant, the sine of theta is a negative, and in the fourth quadrant, the sine of theta is also a negative. Now if we look at tan is the sine of theta divided by the cosine of theta. So we can look at what we've already drawn and work out tan quite easily. So if we look at the first one, we've got a positive divided by a positive, which means the tan of theta will be positive. In the second quadrant, you have a positive divided by a negative, which means the tan of theta will also be negative. In the fourth quadrant, you've got a negative divided by a negative, which means the tan of theta will be positive. And in the fourth quadrant, you've got a negative divided by a positive, which means the tan of theta will be negative. Now there's a little diagram you can draw yourself to help remember this. It goes like this: S, A, T, C. All right, so the A, all are positive. The S stands for only sine is positive. T stands for only tan is positive, which means the rest are negative in that quadrant. And over here, only cosine is positive.